We now move on to Jonathan Sellors, who began his life as an IP legal expert. Now, as I understand, is operationally in charge of the access operations at UK Biobank.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you, Martin, for such a lucid introduction to the sort of principles of data access with big resources. It would be very hard to actually find a better introduction than that. And I think a number of resources should possibly encapsulate really the principles that Martin espoused. Now I'm going to show my complete IT uselessness here. Do I just press enter and it goes on to the next one? Done. Yeah, perfect. I've got about 10 slides, and it's really just setting out how the application process, our access process, works in practice. Who adjudicates the process, and also just to finalise with some issues that we've encountered over the last 2.5 years since we've been open. Because we opened access about on end of March 2012, so we've been going for about 2.5 years now. So the current application process is in 4 steps. There's a registration process, and the idea behind this is that the researcher essentially has to establish to us that they are who they say they are. As Martin said and Bill said, that's easier said than done on some occasions. Then they have to put in a preliminary application, and we make them pay a small amount of money, which we think is quite a good idea because it discourages entirely sort of bogus applications. We have to charge for reasons I'm not going to go into, but they're all to do with VAT, and you'll sort of get sleepy if I carry on that basis. And once the preliminary application has gone through, they have to put in a main application, which is a slightly more detailed description of what they're actually going to do, and at that stage it is approved or not by our access subcommittee, who then, and also in turn, we create our sort of final quote for how much we're going to charge them. I hasten to add on charging. Our whole idea is to essentially facilitate access. We're trying to charge people just on the basis of cost recovery. We're trying to have a process which essentially facilitates access. It's not some sort of labyrinthine legal maze which makes it incredibly difficult for them to get access, because we are fundamentally an open access resort with conditions. And then finally, you have the aspect, just the formal aspect of signing the material transfer agreement and paying, and then the data and samples are released. Now, the mechanism by which data is released is going to change over the next few years, because at the moment we essentially provide a download of pseudo-anonymized data to researchers. As the scale of the data goes up, particularly with the genetics, with the imaging, which Rory talked about yesterday, then we're obviously going to have to find quite fundamentally different means of actually addressing this. So what do we do in the review process? We've got an access team. We're based up in Cheadle, where our main cold storage facility is, just outside Stockport, and they check all the registration credentials that the researchers provide. We have a scientific team who then go through the scientific aspects of the research, and we very much follow the sort of approach that Martin espouses. In other words, we're not trying to second guess their science, but we do try to politely point out when we think it might be a little bit flawed. And we also have some ethical input from the rather irreplaceable Professor Mike Parker, and who actually oversees all of our applications. And I think Martin, he was involved with you, wasn't he, in the Wellcome Trust Case Control Consortium? So he's a very experienced ethicist. And then finally, we have our access subcommittee, which is made up of 4 people. It's chaired by Tara Cam, who is a lawyer and used to work at the Trust. And then we have Sir Andy Haynes, Andrew Hattersley, who's an experienced geneticist, and Sir Mike Rawlins, who spoke yesterday, who's the old chairman of NICE. So, and their remit essentially is they run the access process, both in terms of the applications and the process that we adopt. So what types of applications do we get? The great majority are for data only. And we have as I said, we have a relatively, it's not a minimal threshold, but it is a relatively low threshold. In other words, they've got to prove that they're doing something reasonably sensible, that the research stands up, the power calculations make sense. But again, we're not there to second guess them. And my example of this is that the Nobel Prize winners for graphene previously had a research application in for levitating frogs. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's the sort of thing that we would approve, but it shows it's quite difficult to actually sort of superimpose your own scientific judgment on other researchers. On the other hand, when it comes to samples and recontact, which are, as Martin says, entirely depletable, we have a much higher threshold, and applicants have to to essentially justify that what they're doing is scientifically feasible, and they have to do that really subject to independent peer review as well. So in terms of access to biobanks so far, we launched March 2012. We've got over 1,000 registered researchers, 220 applications in process, and we've approved 90 of those projects, and we haven't approved 8 of them. The main reason we haven't approved those 8 is there were sample applications, and they wanted, for example, the entire lot of 200 samples. And the reason they wanted that was not because they wanted to do any research, it's that they simply just wanted to test the validity of a particular assay they were developing. And again, we thought that's quite an easy one, really. That's not really what the resource was set up for. And we've also sort of not approved and deferred various applications which seem to us to be purely using the resource as a source of controls. So this is, in a way, this is the sort of key graph, because it shows that it's relatively constant, the number of applications we've had since we've opened on a sort of quarterly basis. But all of a sudden, the number's actually starting to go up quite dramatically. And the reason for that is that we've had the linkage data come in about a year ago to most of the participants' health records. We're about to get a lot of the genetic data in a sort of phased way in over the course of the next year and a half. We've had a lot of the reassessment data back. We've conducted a whole range of assays on the samples, and that data will come back in as well, in addition to a whole raft of imaging data. So we're fully expecting the number of applications to go up really quite dramatically over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, and we have to be ready for that in terms of resource. That's the last thing. The last month or so just shows this increase is about to happen. So to split up by type, again, I would just emphasise that we are open access. We don't distinguish between whether an institution is commercial or non-commercial. We don't distinguish between whether an institution applies from abroad or applies from the UK. But thus far, we've had relatively few commercial applications, as you can see. In terms of international applications, although the first application to use the resort was one from the Netherlands, we've had, again, probably not as many as we would have hoped in terms of international applications, and the majority have come from UK academia. And the last pie chart just shows the split. The great majority are for data, a few for samples, and a few for recontact. The main sample one that we've approved is for the UK Believe project, which is a big genetic project on lung function. And one of the reasons that was very helpful is that actually involved genotyping 50,000 of our participants, so we only had to pay to genotype the remaining 450,000 rather than the entire. Now, the results. We've said they're being disseminated. It's taken a couple of years. So we've got 18 peer-reviewed publications, 55 conference presentations, all of which we monitor. In other words, we don't ask for publications. We don't ask for any sort of pre-review of them, unless they're going to contain something potentially contentious, when we would like some sort of input beforehand. And the real thing we do ask for is the results to be returned to us. And what that means is that they have to return the results, but they also have to return all the methodology behind it, so that another researcher can access their results, their methodology, their algorithms, and actually perform the same research that they did, just to essentially check, peer review their work, for want of a better phrase. The main issues we've come across in the last 2.5 years, unsurprisingly, is issues about samples. They're depletable, so we set a much higher bar for that. And the other two, which have caused us quite a lot of thought, is recontact. And the issues in recontact are, how do you recontact a participant so that you don't make them aware of a risk factor or a disease of which they're previously unaware? And that's actually quite difficult. There's no particularly easy answer to that. I mean, some participants will have self-reported certain conditions, and that may be a way forward, but it's not an easy thing to solve. And the other thing we're conscious of in recontact is that if a participant enters into another study, they are subject to the rules of that other study. That other study may have different rules and conditions to ours. In fact, almost inevitable, they will have different rules and conditions to ours. And therefore, they may well have differing policy on the feedback of information. And our policy on feedback is that we provide certain very limited feedback during the actual assessment visits, but we don't supply any feedback of any research or assay results. It's quite conceivable that another another research project might have a different feedback policy, and obviously what we're keen to avoid is a situation where we have biobank data which is subject to our feedback policy and biobank data in the hands of another researcher which is subject to a different feedback policy. Again, I don't have an easy answer for that, but it's just one of the issues that we've identified. And the other one which has caused us a lot of pause, which is I suppose it's good data sharing by another name, which is the linkage to other resources. Now, this isn't linkage to the participants' health records, which is essentially they've quite explicitly consented to, and it's ongoing. And we hope to have completed most of the linkage by the end of next year, when all the primary care data should be in the resource as well. But what it means is really the linkage to other medical research resources. Now, our consent doesn't explicitly cover that. It says linkage to health-related records. I think it's perfectly arguable that it's implicit within that consent that one is entitled to link it to other medical research resources, but it's not expressed. And I haven't seen any other medical research project to date where it is expressed. But it also involves an issue of control of data, in as much as that if we essentially provide data on our participants to another resource, or indeed another resource provides their data to us, the control changes in as much as that our data ends up being essentially under their control, or their data ends up being under our control. And we have to find a way in which that's manageable, because fundamentally we have our arrangement, or our consent for the participants is very much that we would control the manner in which access to their data and samples was managed. I think ultimately, scientifically, it's a thoroughly good thing to encourage this, but it's not a particularly easy thing to solve. Yeah. And my last slide is what we're going to do now is that in light of the ever-increasing number of applications that we're going to have, we're going to see simplify and streamline the process, and that's both from the perspective of the researcher, just to make it a bit shorter. At the moment it takes 3 or 4 months, we're going to try and bring it down to about 2, and from the standpoint of what we actually have to review. And that means we'll have probably a relatively quick fix by next year, first quarter 2015, and then a major overhaul by the end of next year. And that's it. Thank you very much indeed.